A good friend of mine recently asked me to boil down the complexity of the Afghanistan war into its basics, into kind of an overview, and to explain my take on the war as I've been doing in more detail with these videos, but to really bring it together in a couple of statements about what this war is, what it's about, why I have the views of it that I do. And it was kind of the inspiration for this video to be able to explain these things in a way that's clear, that's concise, and as I usually get into the details and into the weeds of different aspects of this long and complicated conflict, to really state simply in an overview fashion what the deal is with the Afghanistan war. Now, obviously, it's complicated. The war is the longest war in American history at this point, coming into about 18 years of this conflict. But going back, the Afghanistan War, the justification for it, coming along with it lost a lot of attention because of the Iraq conflict, was supposed to be or sold to the American people as a war of vengeance for the 9/11 terror attacks perpetrated by Al Qaeda. And the Afghanistan government, the Taliban, was harboring these Al Qaeda terrorists, including Osama bin Laden, and giving them a safe haven. Okay, but the issue is fundamentally deeper. Osama bin Laden's strategy, seeing his experience in the Soviet-Afghan War from 1979 to 1989, in which the Soviet Union attacked and went to war in Afghanistan and eventually gave up and then collapsed. Osama bin Laden saw this as the ability of the mountainous country of Afghanistan to be the stage on which to bring down empires. And so he believed that if they could bring down the empire of the Soviet Union and cause them to collapse, now that's his viewpoint, that they could do the same with the Americans. His goal, of course, being to establish an Islamic caliphate, to establish his interpretation of Islam, to try to create an Islamic state, to force non-Muslims out of the Arabian Peninsula, and which many Muslims agree with that goal if they don't agree with his methods. So he believed in the idea of trying to provoke the United States into a conflict, an endless conflict in Afghanistan, saying statements like all we would have to do would be to take two Mujahideen fighters, these local Muslim fighters in Afghanistan, put them in the farthest area of Afghanistan with an Al Qaeda flag, and the U.S. would continue to pursue them. The U.S. did invade Afghanistan. It had the chance, and a lot of the leaders had the chance to kill off Osama bin Laden and many of the Al Qaeda members at Tora Bora, but kind of let them go. They basically escaped into Pakistan. By the way, there were about 300 Al Qaeda members in 2001, and now there are over 20,000 throughout the whole region. But mostly after they attacked, the U.S. attacked Afghanistan, or began attacking Afghanistan, they all fled into Pakistan, making it more complicated because Pakistan is an American ally. Now, the justification for the war shifted, that if this government, the Taliban government, which allowed Osama bin Laden to have a foothold in the first place, was allowed to remain, then other terror organizations like Al Qaeda or Al Qaeda itself might return and launch attacks on the United States. However, the attacks on the United States weren't launched technically from Afghanistan. They were launched from, they were taken from other places, and they found kind of welcome there. Now, the leaders of the Taliban government, which was the Afghan government at this time, did allow Osama bin Laden there, but they kind of viewed, and they said this of him, that they kind of viewed him as a chicken bone. They couldn't swallow it, they couldn't spit it out, because their culture prizes hospitality. After the bombing, there were times where the Taliban government did offer to give up Osama bin Laden under some different conditions, and they were rejected on all those counts. Now, the Taliban government uh, took over Afghanistan in the 1990s, mid 1990s. It overthrew the government, and it brought in a harsh but effective rule, not anything to what we'd be comfortable with in the West, but it did have the legitimacy of the people. And another thing you have to understand about Afghanistan is that it doesn't view itself as a nation state with one government in charge and a monopoly on legitimate state violence and the modern idea of what a nation state would be. It does things basically by tribal, cultural, and religious law. So a lot of these legal issues and corruption issues, these were handled in more of a tribal warlord basis. So the United States government and military overthrew the government of Afghanistan, which did have legitimacy, and this government of Afghanistan and its supporters, the Taliban, started fighting back against the U.S. government. Okay, so and they have legitimacy in the eyes of the Afghans. Now, the U.S. government established a government there that has the support of the U.S. government, and it's supporting it with arms, it's supporting it with money. Now, the problem is, and this would be the problem no matter what government they put in place, the government has to be strong enough to withstand the attacks of the Taliban and establish itself without legitimacy in the eyes of the people. But it also has to ideally be in line with American values. So the balance has been thrown to, and neither one would work, because you can't just manufacture this without all kinds of other problems being worse than the cures being worse than the disease itself. This government, the Karzai regime, named after the president, established a very corrupt system that most of the Afghans do not view as legitimate, and about 80 to 90% of their justice disputes are settled outside of the official Afghan state, meaning tribal, religious, cultural solutions. So this government is imposed on them and backed by the United States. And it is a government that has chosen and appointed different warlords in order to maintain strength. Now, these different warlords have used the American troops in many cases as not just backup and keeping them in power, but they've used American troops to try to attack their enemies. All they have to say is this group of people here, here, and here are Al-Qaeda or they're Taliban, and get the Americans to go in and fight their battles for them. This creates further illegitimacy in the eyes of the Afghan people, and also causes them more conflict and fighting. Now, the Afghans, many of them don't know about September 11th. They have no idea about the 9/11 attacks. They may have had some local popularity as far as their view of Osama bin Laden, but most of them are tribesmen that don't travel far from the village in which they were born and grew up in. It's a very primitive area, and all they see are foreign invaders into their country who do not share their religion, who do not speak their language, who they don't know why they're there. They just know they're there attacking, that their friends, cousins, children, grandparents, whoever may die in these attacks or have died in these attacks, and so they fight back. The Americans, also not speaking the religion, not having the culture, military, they often see this fighting back as these are the Al-Qaeda, these are the terrorists, these are the Taliban, these are our enemies, that's why they're fighting with us, when really all they're seeing are foreign invaders. And so the task of the US government over these 19 years has been to try to fight the war on terror and eradicate terrorism, which is an impossible goal, which the expanse of government could only get further because you're trying to eliminate something that always is going to exist in some form, especially when terrorism has been shown and demonstrated to be most likely in the cases of foreign occupation. So they've tried to fight the war on terrorism. And they've also tried to prop up and establish a government of corruption and warlordism that that has to both maintain its strength against this other former government there, or be in line with American values and be probably destroyed because of a crisis of legitimacy. However, there is some hope for the end of this conflict. In Qatar, right now, the Taliban have been in talks with the American military and American government under the Trump administration, and they have been discussing an end to the war. Now, there's been a standstill in negotiations because the Taliban said they would only negotiate if all the Americans left Afghanistan, if they got rid of foreign occupation. And the Americans said, we don't negotiate with terrorists. We don't negotiate under these terms. We're not going to leave until you come to the negotiating table. The Taliban has presumably given up on some of that, and they're in talks to end, hopefully, this conflict. Now, I'm a bit pessimistic about whether or not that will actually happen, but that's the Afghanistan war basically in a nutshell. That though Osama bin Laden is dead, his son and others have said that he basically would have died with a smile on his face because he provoked America, the American government, into a long, costly war with none of the pre-war outcomes being accomplished, and a war that could hasten financial collapse. Now, that's not the same exactly as what happened to the Soviet Union, or if Afghanistan was the definitive end of the Soviet Union in their war there. But this was his goal. So this is why, even after the death of Osama bin Laden, there has still been fighting in Afghanistan. Now the American people, for the most part, as some polls have shown, are ready for this conflict to be over and ready for the troops to be brought home. So hopefully some peace can be restored with regard to the Afghanistan conflict, and this long set of years in this conflict can finally be brought to an end.